Inside a dim billiard parlor in La Lima, Cortez, Honduras, the air is heavy with the smell of chalk and sweat. 62-year-old Jorge Alberto Acosta is winding down 4 blocks from his house. He is a marked man, and for months, he's been watching his back ever since he led a strike against Chiquita, the biggest banana company in the world. Right there in that billiard parlor, Jorge thinks he's safe. But then, 2 men move through the darkness of the doorway, hate in their eyes. No demands are made, no names are called. They just fire. As Jorge collapses onto the floor between the pool tables, the message is sent. Never mess with Chiquita. His murder feels personal, but that's because it is. However, it's also something very familiar. Because of bananas, workers have been gunned down in Colombia in the famous 1928 Banana Massacre. Even the CIA has sponsored coups to protect banana profits, and worse, chemicals sprayed on plantations later left men sterile and dead. Today, we're peeling back the skin to reveal the dark world of bananas. One night on October 5th, 1928, a meeting was held in a crowded room in Magdalena, Colombia. Inside the room, men sat at a table with weary eyes and hands roughened from hard work. Lopez Rojano leaned forward first. His voice carried the weight of long days that never seemed to end. He talked about waking before sunrise, cutting bananas until his hands cramped, then watching a contractor take nearly a third of his pay before it ever reached his pocket. Across from him sat Erasmo Coronel. When Lopez finished, Erasmo cleared his throat and said the word no one had dared to say out loud before: strike. Erasmo was one of the leaders of the Unión Sindical, a trade union in Magdalena that protects banana workers' rights. The formation of this union at the time was out of desperation because the workers were extremely tired, hungry, and frustrated. For years, they had been treated like tools instead of people by the United Fruit Company. The people in Colombia had a special nickname for this company, El Pulpo, or the Octopus. They called it that because its long, greedy tentacles seemed to reach into every part of their lives, grabbing their land and controlling their government. But the workers were finally tired of these tentacles and demanded a change. So, following their meeting that night, they sent a list of 9 demands to the company. They asked for fair pay, proper insurance, decent housing, safe hospitals, and the end of exploitative practices like payment in coupons instead of money. They weren't asking for luxury, right? Just basic things. But El Pulpo saw this as a threat. They called the strikers communists, and communism was not a word the US liked to hear, but it was what the United Fruit Company kept feeding them with.
Is one of the most dangerous, communistic. Look at that word that they use, communistic. It's like a word that doesn't even exist or wouldn't even be considered grammatical.
So the US started pressuring the Colombian government to deal with the striking workers, or else they would send US Marines to do the work for them. Terrified of a US invasion, the Colombian government declared martial law and sent in this guy, General Carlos Cortez Vargas, to deal with the strikers. This is where everything got out of hand really quickly. You see, on December 5th, over 1,000 strikers gathered at the town square to hear a speech from their governor, hoping for good news. Mothers were also there with their children, waiting. But the governor never showed up. Instead, General Vargas and his 300 soldiers, armed with machine guns, surrounded the strikers, awaiting orders. By 1:30 a.m., he received orders to disperse the crowd. The general stood up and shouted that everyone had 5 minutes to leave, but the square was so packed that it was impossible to move. The people stayed put, many of them refusing to believe their own army would ever hurt them. Then, after 3 warning shots, the general gave the order: open fire. The machine guns went off, sending a rain of bullets into the crowd. People were shot down where they stood. Yet when the sun came up the next morning, the government claimed only 9 people had died, 1 for each of the workers' demands. But the truth was much bloodier. The US government later admitted that more than 1,000 people were killed that night. Some say the soldiers loaded the bodies onto trains and dumped them into the ocean to hide the evidence. Erasmo Coronel, the man in the bow tie, was one of those who never made it home.
There's a check mark on Bernardino Guerrero and a check mark on Erasmo Coronel. Erasmo Coronel had been shot down. They had obviously given this photograph to the local authorities to know who to shoot during those massacres.
You might think that after such a terrible crime, the company would be punished, but they weren't. The octopus simply changed its name to Chiquita Brands International and kept right on going. And the scary part is, the spirit of that massacre never really went away.
That massacre is the great-great-great-grandfather of the massacres, the deaths, the devastation that's going on now.
Even in recent years, standing up to the banana companies is a death sentence. Just like Jorge Alberto, whom we talked about before, other leaders have been targeted for wanting basic rights. But as bad as these stories are, we are just getting started. Because when a leader finally tried to stand up for the poor, a far bigger power stepped in to stop him. It's 1951, and Jacobo Arbenz has just become president of Guatemala. He was full of ideas about making life better for his people. He remembered how the lands had been taken from the indigenous communities long ago, and he wanted to give them back. So Arbenz wrote a law called Decree 900, which said that any big landowner with fields lying empty had to give that land to peasants so they could farm it and feed their families. Only landowners with a lot of land were affected, and the government even paid them bonds equal to the value of the land. This isn't a bad idea, right? And guess what? By 1954, over 1 million acres had been handed out, helping around 500,000 people, mostly indigenous, start farms and improve their lives. For once, the little people were winning. But not everyone liked this.
His government confiscates thousands of acres of land from the multinational company United Fruits.
This added up to being a national security threat to the United States of America.
The United Fruit Company, who were making twice as much as the Guatemalan government, certainly didn't like the idea. They were unhappy that Arbenz's law took away the land they weren't using, and that he supported strikes when workers demanded better pay. Seeing that they were losing land and face, they did what they usually did to their enemies. They played the communism card. The company paid people to write reports and do PR campaigns claiming Guatemala was being taken over by communists. They even spent over $500,000 to convince the US government to get involved. But did the US listen? Oh yes, they did. Except this time around, the CIA was the puppet for the United Fruit Company. In 1952, the CIA, authorized by US President Harry Truman, prepared for a coup. The plan was called Operation PB Fortune, but it never happened because the operation, which was supposed to be a secret, went public. So the State Department had to cancel the plan to protect the image of the United States. So maybe good had finally won over evil, or maybe not so fast. After Dwight Eisenhower was elected the 34th President of the United States, he relaunched the plan in 1953. Except this time around, it was called Operation PB Success. Castillo Armas, the Guatemalan military officer loyal to the US and the United Fruit Company, was chosen to lead the group. With about 150 mercenaries, Castillo Armas relied less on bullets and more on fear. You see, on June 18, 1954, his men crossed into Guatemala while a radio station called The Voice of Liberation filled the air with lies about rebel troops closing in on the capital. This made Castillo's invasion feel massive even though it wasn't. At the same time, the US exposed a weapon shipment Arbenz planned to use to arm peasants. What this did was to intensify the doubt between Arbenz and his generals, pushing them further away from defending him. As the broadcast spread panic and doubt, soldiers began to lose faith, and many believed the war was already over before it truly began. Eventually, Arbenz realized he had little choice, so on June 27, 1954, he resigned, saying he wanted to avoid a US invasion and protect the reforms he had fought for. But the craziest part of everything is that even after Arbenz went into exile, the CIA and the United Fruit Company refused to let him be. The CIA spread false stories, doctored his papers, and tried to ruin his reputation with every chance they got. However, the most humiliating thing happened to him when he was about to leave Guatemala. At the airport, authorities forced him to strip in front of cameras, claiming he was hiding jewelry. But of course, they found nothing. Unfortunately, the public shaming, which lasted for an hour, had already damaged his reputation further. For someone who had fought to give land to the people, Arbenz ended up stripped of power, dignity, and home, while the company that had pushed for his overthrow kept shipping bananas and counting profits. But even when these big banana companies stopped plotting coups, they still couldn't stay away from the news for the wrong reasons. Many years later, they would appear on the news again for something even more shocking.
Workers in the agricultural chemical department there were tested and retested. The results were shocking. 20 out of 50 in that department alone are sterile.
This is Alberto Andini. He was one of the men who worked on a banana plantation owned by the United Fruit Company back in the 1990s in Honduras. Every day, he walked into fields that smelled sharp and strange, even though the bananas looked healthy. Nobody explained much to him or warned him about the stench. They just handed him a mask and told him to get to work. Yet, the masks made him sweat, burned his skin, and still let the smell through. And as it would turn out, that smell was coming from a pesticide that every worker in the plantation, including Alberto, was forced to get used to. But what Alberto didn't know was that that pesticide was going to ruin his life within a few years. You see, over time, something terrible kept happening. His wife would become pregnant and then lose the baby. Then it would happen again and again. Later, doctors and activists began pointing to the same thing sprayed over the banana plants: Nemagon. Nemagon, also called DBCP, had already been banned in the United States back in the late 1970s because it caused things like blindness, cancer, and sterility. Yet in Central America, such as in Honduras, Nicaragua, and Guatemala, it kept being used through the 1980s and even into the 1990s. And this led to the tragedy that Alberto had to deal with. But the craziest has to be what Rene Hernandez, a union activist, saw. He talked about men who became sterile and families torn apart by cancer. One story stayed with him. In a small town, almost an entire family died, starting with the father, after he fell terribly sick. The mother became sick too, and so did the children. Then some of the kids started dying from the same illness that took their father. They lived right in the middle of the plantations where Nemagon was sprayed. The poison didn't stop at the plants, but covered their house and settled into their lives. Across borders, the same story played out. Francesco Lumbe worked on a banana plantation in Chinandega, Nicaragua. Pipes hung above the plants, dripping chemicals as he worked underneath. Nobody told him it was dangerous, and so he continued to work like that for 7 years before his body began to break down. His kidneys and memory failed, his eyesight worsened, and his ears hurt. But as if that wasn't enough, around him, men his age started dying at 25 or 30 years old, and they all showed the same signs. This is why, for years, former plantation workers have continued to flood the streets in protests. They ask for help, for care, for justice. Many had already lost children, while others had buried friends. Companies like Dole Food and Chiquita have been forced for years to pay hundreds of millions of dollars as compensation for the crime of using banned pesticides.
The payments made by the company at all times were motivated by the company's good faith desire and concern for the safety of all of its employees.
But for some families, the money came too late. Children were already gone and lives were already damaged.
When you learned
¿Y cuando te enteraste?
that you were sterile,
Que eres estéril.
how did that make you feel?
¿Cómo te sentiste?
Standard Fruit and Dole are not liable to these plaintiffs. There is no causation, no exposure, no causation. These plaintiffs' claim fails.
So now that you've seen where bananas come from before they reach your table, our journey to Banana Land is ended. We hope you enjoyed the trip. We know you like bananas.